Rod, as we know it today, you entered the war when the Vietnam War was raging. What was it like being 19, 20 years old going into the service?
At the time, as you and I were speaking a few minutes ago, I don't even remember that much about being aware of what was happening with that. And I guess that was my own negligence of not being involved in the news as what was happening. But when I knew that I was getting closer to being drafted, then I became a little more knowledgeable because I said, well, this is going to affect me. And it wasn't until that I really received my orders to be sent overseas that the realization for me, you know, said, well, this is the real deal here. And although I was not being sent to Vietnam, I was being sent to Thailand. And when you look at the map, well, Thailand is right next to Vietnam. Okay, well, how close is that? It was some concerning. I think it's just like anything that is unknown, the fear of the unknown a little bit until you get there and kind of fall into somewhat of a routine. It is a little bit frightening.
Now, you started April Fool's Day is when you got your orders to go overseas?
That's correct. There was, like I said, the draft was still in place at that particular time, and there were 7 or 8 of us here from Lafayette County that had to report at the same day, and we went over to Lexington to be picked up by a bus. It was on April the 1st, April Fool's Day. And we said, well, this has to be a joke. I know the government is playing a joke on us. And then the bus was late getting there to pick us up, so they said it has to be a joke. But it wasn't. It did arrive, and the career started on April 1st, April Fool's Day, right?
What were some of your duties at that time overseas? What was it like?
I was stationed in Thailand, and I was in communications. There was most of the communications was all top secret type of thing. I lived in or worked in a building. It was a metal building. There was no windows and only 2 doors. It was full of electronic equipment and communications equipment. And we were just involved with keeping communications up and going between several countries, Thailand, Vietnam, some went back to the States. If there was somebody that was not able to make communications work for whatever reason, then they would contact us and we would have to troubleshoot that particular circuit to find out as to what the problem was.
How long were you overseas?
I was overseas 18 months. I spent the first 11 there in Thailand, and then I was transferred to Okinawa for the remainder of the time.
And what happened from Okinawa on?
Well, then my time was up, and I left Okinawa. I came back to the States, and it was there about another 9 months before I was discharged. The Vietnam War, this would have been in 1972. The war was winding down, so they were kicking a lot of guys out, or kicking them out early, so to speak, I guess, because they were having a reduction in force.
At that time, being overseas and knowing you're going to come home, did you quite know how you would be received overseas when you were there? Did you know how you would be received coming home?
No, I mean, obviously we were aware of some of the news media, and you'd get newspapers, and you'd see some of that activity, that it was not a very good time in our country at that particular time frame. But I had no anticipation as to when we landed back in the States as to how we would be greeted. I just didn't. It was another one of those things like, well, that's happening to someone else. That's not going to really happen to us as we get there.
And what happened from the moment that you stepped foot back on soil here in America?
Well, we flew into California, and it was late in the evening, and as I recall, it was a big 747 Champagne flight had landed, and I think that it was probably when those airplanes were just becoming into use, and we were flying in uniform in those days, and our plane unloaded, and this woman walked up to me, and I can just remember she got right in my face, called me a baby killer and a murderer and all that kind of. And it really took me off guard. I didn't know what to think or what to expect. I certainly didn't expect that. And she didn't know anything about me. She didn't know anything about where we had been. And for her to come up to say that to us, it was quite a shock. And as you and I were talking a while ago, I mean, that's been over 40 years ago, and it's still very clear.
Now, although you were out of the military at that time, the story doesn't end there. A couple years later, several years later, you get back in. Talk to me about that process.
Well, I spent almost 3 years in the Army, and I got out. I really don't know why I got out at the time, actually. But some years went by, and that was in 1972 when I got out of the Army. And then in the middle to late 80s, the U.S. Navy started developing what they called a fleet hospital concept, which is a lot like the Army MASH units that was in Vietnam and Korea. And they were looking for medical people, folks that were already trained and working their civilian jobs as paramedics and EMTs and x-ray people and whatever, because they were going to develop these hospitals, just like before, all made out of tents, but more modernistic. I mean, you're going to have the most modern equipment available and all of those kind of things. So they were looking for those kind of people. And it so happened that Stanton Thompson, who was also in the Navy Reserves, was here in Higginsville, and he came and talked to me about joining up. And I thought about it for a little bit, and I said, yeah, I'll do that, because I wanted to still give more other than what I had already given.
And so what was the process like of getting overseas, getting those hospitals built?
Well, then I was in the Navy Reserve, so it's like your National Guard and your other reserve units. You have 1 weekend per month that you have drill, and you have 2 weeks during the year that you have to go for training. So that was in 1987, February of 87, when I went in. And we would do our trainings and those kind of things. And then in 1990, the fall of 90, is when Desert Shield kind of started becoming an issue, and there was problems in the Middle East, And I remember that I was on a church youth mission. We went to New Mexico in the fall of 90. And I remember that one morning I saw on the news while I was on that church mission that there was a buildup that we were going to start sending troops and stuff to the Middle East, over into Iraq and those areas, Saudi Arabia. And I thought, well, surely we won't get called up for that, And as it turned out, later in the fall, the scuttlebutt was, that we were going to be deployed. We just didn't know when. So it was a roller coaster of emotion over those several months there in the fall of 90. We're going to go. When are we going to go? Well, we're not going to go down. Till finally the last week or so of in December of 1990, it says, yeah, you're going to be going the first part of January of 91. And I can remember my job then, I was working for the city of Higginsville as the ambulance director, and I can remember thinking back, as I've thought back several times since then, that I don't even remember much what happened during that month of December while I was here. So I was so preoccupied with being deployed again that I just don't remember that. So then we were called up in the first week of January, and I think we actually left on something like January the 12th, and went to Fort Dix, New Jersey. Extremely cold there, lots of snow on the ground, ice in January. And I remember thinking, we're going to the desert, but we're training in wintertime conditions here. But that was just part of it. So we were there about 3 weeks before we were sent over to, actually flew into Bahrain.
And once again, the uncertainty comes into play, makes you very nervous about everything that's going on.
Well, it's different this time too, because when I went during the Army, I was 20 years old and not married or anything like that. And this time, I was 40 years old and married and have two boys at home. So it was a lot more concerning. Uh, Chemical weapons is what was supposed to have been in the area at the time was concerning. It's one thing if they're shooting bullets and bombs and things at you. It's another thing if there's this gas that's floating about that you can't see or hear, and so it was concerning.
For people that don't understand or maybe don't remember Desert Storm, you had all this buildup, but then what happened? Explain that conflict.
Well, that's when the first George Bush was in office, and there was a big buildup starting in the fall of 1990 of military, and it was a concern about what Saddam Hussein was doing, and so they started this big buildup because they thought that it was going to be, if we got involved, it was going to be a major conflict, with lots of deaths, lots of injuries. And so that buildup started in the fall, and then it came in the spring, or actually in January then in February of '91, and were the day that it was started, that we're going to start the conflict, and it turned out to be only lasting just a few hours. The intelligence that we had, I guess, at the time didn't prove out to be 100% correct, so it was not the conflict that we had anticipated that was going to be. We were all in place as far as the hospital settings, and we had the troops and all those kind of things that were there, and fortunately, we weren't really needed to that degree. It sounds kind of crazy, but for all of us who train to do those kind of things, and you get deployed, and yes, it is fearful, but we're there, we were ready to do our job. And there was something that we talked about, and I've talked about since, is that there is no doubt in my mind that the type of medical treatment that we would have provided to those combatants would have been second to none. I mean, we had the personnel, we had the training, we had the experience. There was lots of people in that hospital setting. I'm talking about the hospital that we built. There was lots of people in that setting that had phenomenal backgrounds, and they were all civilians that were part of this reserve unit that was called up to do this. So the amount of care that they would have been getting would have been top rate.
Looking back on your military experience, what are some things that you have taken away? What are some moments that you will really remember?
Well, one of them is the one I spoke a while ago, that is when the night before we left Fort Dix, New Jersey to go over to Desert Storm. We've been trying, we knew that there would be going, we didn't know exactly, there was on again, off again type of things. And of course there's thousands of people on that base all waiting to hear get that same information when you're going. And phones were not always available. So the night that we found out that we were leaving the next day is when I got a phone and called home, and my wife and the two boys were on the phone, and I tell them, I said, well, we're leaving tomorrow. And I remember it being a difficult thing to say, because here again, going off into that unknown so far away, and now I was married with two small children at home, as to how difficult that was going to be. And my youngest son kind of heard me kind of choke up a little bit. He said, "What's wrong, Dad? You got a cold?" I said, "Yeah, that's what it is." It wasn't a cold at all. It was just the emotion that was a part of that. But the other things is the camaraderie of it. It doesn't make any difference what branch I think that you're in. If you have served, there is that brotherhood. I mean, that you can relate. Everybody is not in combat, but everybody has gone through a lot of the same kind of trainings, and they know. And there is that brotherhood, that if you have been and you have served, you're part of that, and it's kind of a neat feeling.